Okay, welcome in everybody. Good Tuesday evening to you. It's 7 o'clock. The Armageddon has been averted for 2 weeks, which is good because I had plans this weekend. Welcome into the show. My name is Brian Schott. I am the publisher and managing editor of Utah Political Watch, utahpolitics.news. And I wanted to welcome you in this night. We got a lot to talk about this evening. A lot going on, and I want to hear from you. If there's anything on your mind, please leave that in the chat, and I will try to get to those questions as soon as possible. We're live on multiple platforms tonight: Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitch, LinkedIn, TikTok, all those places. I can read the chat in most of them. And if you have anything you want to bring up, please let me know. But as I said when we started off the show, the Armageddon has been averted, which is good, for 2 weeks. President Donald Trump, after threatening to end a civilization today, came back and came out right about an hour and a half before his 8 p.m. deadline, and said that he had agreed to a ceasefire with Iran. I'm still trying to read about what the parameters are, but the good news is he's not going to be unleashing destruction on Iran. He had promised to attack civilian infrastructure targets, power plants, things that are a war crime. But he backed off, he backed down, and they have a 2-week ceasefire, which, any ceasefire is a good ceasefire in my mind. Not going to spend too much time on that, but there was an astonishing article today in the New York Times by Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman, and say what you will about them. I admire Maggie Haberman. But it is a deeply reported article on how Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli intelligence service basically duped Trump into starting a war with Iran. If you have a chance, read the article. I left a gift link on most of my social media, so you can read the entire thing there without going through their paywall. It was very interesting. After Netanyahu made his pitch to Trump, according to this article, the U.S. intelligence services scrambled to try and look at what the Israelis had proposed. And I'm reading here. U.S. officials assessed that the first two objectives, which included regime change, were achievable with American intelligence and military power. They assessed that the third and fourth parts of Mr. Netanyahu's pitch, which included the possibility of the Kurds mounting a ground invasion of Iran, were detached from reality. When Mr. Trump joined the meeting, Mr. Ratcliffe, that's John Ratcliffe, CIA director, briefed him on the assessment. The CIA director used one word to describe the Israeli prime minister's regime change scenarios, quote, farcical. At that point, Secretary of State Marco Rubio cut in. In other words, it's bullshit, he said. Several others jumped in, including Vice President J.D. Vance, just back from Azerbaijan, who also expressed strong skepticism about the prospect of regime change. The president then turned to General Kane. Quote, General, what do you think? General Kane replied, Sir, this is, in my experience, standard operating procedure for the Israelis. They oversell, and their plans are not always well developed. They know they need us, and that's why they're hard selling. Anyway, read the entire article. It's at NewYorkTimes.com, NYTimes.com. And it just basically lays out how President Donald Trump and his administration were duped into getting the getting into a war with Iran. So I cannot recommend this article any higher. It's great. So take your time and read that. If there's anything else you want to talk about, please leave it in the chat tonight. We've already got some questions popping up on a number of social media platforms. Let's start this really quick. Let's talk about election season, because we are in convention season, and we are in the season where people are getting signatures to appear on the ballot. And I had a story earlier this week about how two Democratic incumbents, failed to get the required number of signatures to get on the ballot. Their deadline, the Democratic convention, is on Saturday, and so their deadline was 2 weeks ago. Representative Andrew Stoddard, who's looking for his 5th term in the House, he needed 1,000 signatures. He got 990, so he fell short. If he wants to advance, he needs to get at least 45% at the convention on Saturday, which will be held at Jordan High School. His opponent in that district, Wendy Davis, Democrat as well, who's challenging him for the nomination, she did get the required number of signatures. So she's on the primary and cannot be eliminated from the ballot at all. That's the first one. The second one is Democratic Representative John Arthur, and he won the special election in December of last year to replace Representative Galen Benyon in the legislature. She was elected mayor of Cottonwood Heights, so she stepped down. John Arthur, who's pretty ubiquitous on social media, he won the special election to replace her in the legislature. He initially filed to collect signatures to run for a first full term in the House. He didn't turn in any, according to the state website. So he also has to rely on delegates at the convention on Saturday. His opponent, Stephen Miller, not that Stephen Miller, but Stephen Miller, also filed to collect signatures. He did not turn in any either. So those are the two Democrats this weekend who are dealing with, who must get at least 45% of the vote at the convention if they want to continue, if they want to move on to the primary election. Now, I don't have any insight as to whether or not they will get those votes or whether they're in trouble, but I did find it interesting that they did not turn in the signatures that they needed. Stoddard, as I said, was 10 signatures short. If you look at some of the other candidates out, there's not very many candidates who have collected the required number of signatures, even though they have filed for it. Now, the deadline for Republicans in Salt Lake County, Davis County, Washington County, Utah County, it was on Friday of last week, and those signatures are currently being verified, and their convention is a week from this coming Saturday. And so we should find out sometime this week whether or not they have the required number of signatures. But very few of them, very few candidates have collected the signatures that they need, even though they have filed for it. On the Republican side, right now in Senate District 6, Tammy Tran, who's running to replace Jerry Stevenson, who is not running for another term, she has collected the 2,000 signatures needed for a Senate seat. And the only other Republican who has collected enough signatures is Kelly Smith, who's challenging Brady Brammer in Senate District 21. We're waiting for all the other ones to show up. I find it very interesting that in Senate District 7, President Stuart Adams said he was going to collect 6 signatures. He has turned in so far 1,577, so he's a little more than 400 short. Stephanie Hollis, who's also running in that district as a Republican, challenging him for the nomination, one of 3 Republicans challenging him for the nomination, she has only turned in just under 1,300 signatures. So she needs another 700 to be verified this week. Her deadline for turning them in was on Friday. She can't turn in any more. And I expect those to show up sometime in the next week or so. So that's very interesting. Someone asked whether or not a challenger, I'm sorry, I lost your thing in the chat, but a challenger to Representative Jordan Tusher in House District 44 had collected enough signatures. That's Scott Stevenson, who is challenging Tusher for the Republican nomination. He has turned in enough signatures. He has qualified for the primary ballot, so he cannot be eliminated from the race at convention, even though he's going up against Jordan Tusher, who's arguably one of the most powerful people in the House of Representatives. One race that I am very interested in, is HD 39 with Representative Ken Ivory. Ken Ivory, he is being challenged again for the nomination by Lisa Dean. Lisa Dean got enough signatures last time around in the 2024 election, and she took him to a primary. I think Ivory won that primary by about 500 votes or something. It was a very, very close election. She is collecting signatures again, as is Ryan Jackson, who is also a Republican challenging Ken Ivory for the nomination. And Ryan Jackson also has not turned in the required number of signatures, or does not have the valid number of signatures. And basically, that is a race where if neither of them get the needed number of signatures, they will be eliminated at convention. Ken Ivory is beloved by the delegates, and that's where he would prefer to win the nomination. I remember in 2024, I was at the Salt Lake County Convention, and Ken Ivory got enough support in convention to win the nomination outright, but Lisa Dean had collected signatures to get on the primary ballot, and he was extremely miffed about that. He got about 36 votes from delegates at convention, which is enough to secure the nomination outright. Think about that for a second. Just 36 votes at convention. That's all he needed. But he was forced into a primary by Lisa Dean, and it was a very close election. Ken Ivory, and I'm going to be very interested to get a look at his campaign disclosures and spending, because I've heard he's hired consultants for one of the first times in his career to help him run his campaign, because he was so worried about being challenged by Dean and Jackson for the Republican nomination in that district. So we can talk about elections tonight. We can talk about any number of things, and I've got a lot of things on my docket that I want to talk about as well. Hiram Cordingly on Instagram says, what are your thoughts on a post going around showing a number of Utah counties as the biggest change from Republican to Democrat over the last 15 years? I've seen that post on social media. There's absolutely no context. I don't know what metric they're using, and it's between 2012 and now, and they say that counties are like shifting 38%. I don't know what elections they're looking at. I don't know what metrics they're looking at, because if you look at a lot of the races, it's not, I don't know where those numbers are coming from. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So you can see that it's engagement bait as far as I'm concerned, because there's he doesn't show his work. He doesn't show what the underlying data is underneath those numbers. So look at those, but I really wish this person would show their work and let us know what metrics they are using to show the shift. What elections are they looking at? Are they looking at the 2022 U.S. Senate race? Are they factoring that in, where there was no Democrat in the race at all? Or are they leaving that out? Also, what happened between 2012 and now? Donald Trump was the Republican nominee in 2016, 2020, and 2024. Utah is not a fan of Donald Trump. How did they account for Evan McMullin being a presidential candidate in Utah in 2016, where he got almost 20% of the vote in the state? How does he account for that? So that whole post makes no sense. It's just engagement bait, and some of the dumbest people on X, and I know I repeat myself, but some of the dumbest people on X/Twitter are losing their minds about how Utah is shifting left. They're dum-dums. They're dum-dums. They don't know what they're looking at, and they're reactionaries, and it makes them mad, and they like to be mad. So I kind of discount that. So those are my thoughts on that post. BNL33910 on YouTube says, any idea why Tyler Cotter decided to primary pitcher? She got an A+ rating from Better Utah and is my senator. As far as I know, she hasn't made any votes that I was unhappy about. I have no idea, but that's the way the system is. Just because you are an incumbent doesn't mean that you don't get challenged. And I think it's healthy. I don't know what the reasoning is. Both Cotter and Pitcher got signatures, so this won't be decided at convention. This will go to a primary. Both of them got enough signatures. And a lot of times in elections, it's all timing. Now, Pitcher will have an advantage because she's the incumbent. She's got the name recognition. Tyler has to spend resources introducing himself to voters. So I would say the Pitcher has the advantage if you just look at the numbers. Whoever wins that race, whoever wins that nomination, is going to be the senator in Senate District 14 for the next 4 years because they will be unopposed in November. No Republican, no other candidate has filed for that race. Nathan Detroit on Twitch says, how many delegates is 45% of their House district at the Democratic convention? We talk often about how small the delegate pool at the Republican convention. I'm guessing it's even less for the Dems. My guess is that it is smaller. I don't have the exact numbers. I should probably ask the Democrats for that, and do that math for you. But yes, I suspect that that's the case. That 45% at convention is not a large number of delegates, and whether they'll even show up or not is yet another question that is another question that's going to factor into that outcome. So anyway, that's what's going on with some of those legislative races, and we can talk more about it. I'm really starting to try to dig in and understand those races. I'm going to give you all a preview of something I've been working on that I'm pretty excited about, and I'm going to be unveiling it. It's going to be a subscriber-only thing this week that I'm going to unveil this week, but it's something that I'm pretty excited about, and I'll give you all a little sneak peek of what it is tonight. So stay tuned for all of that. If you have said anything in the chat, please repost your questions. I've lost them. I had to refresh one of my browser windows, and so I've lost those questions. And so if you want to repost your questions, I'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. Talking more about elections, there was a pretty good article in Politico today by Sam Benson, who used to write for the Deseret News, talking about how Blake Moore is being challenged by Carrie Ann Lisenby and the Republican anger. And we've talked about that on this show before, about how Republicans are trying to turn his work with Better Boundaries into a campaign issue. Republicans are furious that we have a new congressional map for the 2016 elections. They're calling him Salt Lake Blake, as a way to get their digs in against Moore, trying to say that since he is responsible for the map, they're trying to scapegoat him for this map because he was part of the original Better Boundaries group that got Prop 4 on the ballot. He's saying that they should get he should run in this new 1st congressional district that he created. So that's a pretty good article, and we'll talk about that in a second. I want to get to this question. Serald66 on YouTube says, Boise, Idaho wrapped their City Hall flagpoles in pride color to evade the new anti-flag law. Any idea for Salt Lake City, Utah? Yeah, I saw that. I thought it was pretty great. It's a creative idea. Very creative idea. The kind of thing that you would expect. It's exploiting a loophole. It's exactly the same thing that Salt Lake City did last year when they exploited the loophole in the law, in Trevor Lee's law, exploited the loophole in Trevor Lee's flag ban. Just the kind of, creative thinking that you would expect, that we've come to expect from Mayor Mendenhall. We also saw that a couple of weeks ago when she came out and with a ordinance restricting water use by the new proposed ICE facility in Salt Lake City. So I think, if you're going to write a law, people are going to try to find a loophole. If you're going to do something like that, that is, just a message, then you shouldn't be mad when people exploit a loophole to try to send a message back. Whether or not you like this kind of tit for tat, whether or not you think it's the kind of thing the government should be doing, you do have to applaud the creativity. You have to take your hats off for that. Elliot Nutter says, any general conference reaction since it happened over the weekend? I don't, unfortunately, I tend to not pay attention to general conference. I'm not a member of the church, full disclosure. So I really don't pay attention to it. I grew up Presbyterian. Now I'm decidedly agnostic. So I really don't have any reactions to it. Sorry, I don't have any information on that. Okay, well, let's talk about this. An article I wrote this morning about how Utah is going to dox all y'all, your information, your voter registration information is going to be public beginning next month. About 300,000 voters previously marked their voter registration as private, meaning it could not be disclosed under any circumstances. Lawmakers passed SB 153 this year, and what that does is it's going to reclassify all of those private records and records that are marked as withheld. We have a third classification. We have public, we have private, and we have withheld. And withheld is if you have a court order, if you're a police officer, if you've been a domestic violence victim, dating violence, you can have your information withheld if it would put you at risk, and it cannot be released under any circumstances. Well, all those records are going to be public beginning next month and available for purchase at the Lieutenant Governor's office for the low price of $1,050. I wrote this morning how we got to this point, how we got here, where essentially the state is going to dox everybody on the voter rolls. If you marked your information as private, or if you have withheld, that protection disappears on May 25th. Now, under SB 153, there are some carve-outs. You can request to have your information withheld from public if you are at risk. Again, domestic violence, court order, police officer. If you're a public figure who has been threatened, you can go into the county clerk and request that you keep your information private. But for most people in Utah, your information is going to be available publicly. I had a lot of people freaking out. I wrote about this during the session, and nobody really seemed to pay attention. Audrey Evans says, are we suing for this? Well, you can't. There's not really much that you can do, because this, as I wrote this morning, it used to be how the system that we're moving into on May 25th is what the system used to be. Back in 2014, somebody from New Hampshire bought the state voter file for $1,050 or whatever it was at that time. And he posted the whole thing online. Names, addresses, phone numbers, birth dates, party affiliation. And lawmakers panicked when this database showed up online. So Karen Main, former Senator Karen Main, sponsored SB 36, which limited who could buy the voter file. Now, she was going to make it very hard for anybody to get the voter file, but there was a lot of pushback. She was going to say for no commercial purposes. But there was some pushback like insurance companies. Anyway, so there are some carve-outs about what you can get the voter file for. But SB 36 limited that. And I think it's like for political, academic purposes, research, journalistic, those are the reasons why you can buy the voter file. But this guy from New Hampshire just bought it because he could and posted it online. And lawmakers freaked out. So that was the first thing that happened. So before 2014, even after 2014, everybody's voter information was publicly available, except if you had a court order or you were a police officer. Okay. Then in 2017, the legislature passed HB 348. Now that was when the lawmakers decided that voters could request to keep their campaign and their voter registration information private. You didn't have to have a reason. When you registered to vote, you could say, I want to keep my information private. So that system started in 2017. Made it through the legislature, and people started to mark their voter registration as private. Well, political parties and political candidates started to complain because they couldn't get that information and they couldn't run their campaigns. They couldn't campaign effectively. They couldn't communicate with voters because they couldn't get that information. There are about 300,000 voters in the state that political parties just could not get information on. So lawmakers made the change again. They passed SB 83 in 2020, and that let political organizations and candidates access private records for campaign purposes. There are a lot of restrictions on who they can share that information with and a lot of safeguards for that information. But political parties and campaigns can get the entire voter file except for the withheld, that classification that cannot be for any disclosed for any reason. And that's the system that we are under currently. So it hasn't always been that you've been able to make your voter registration information private. That's only been in effect since 2017. But the 2020 election is what lit the fuse on these moves to undo voter privacy in the state and got us to where we are now. As you remember, Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden. He made a lot of false claims, baseless claims, fact-free claims. They were lies about the fact that the reason he lost the election was due to massive voter fraud. There's no evidence to support that at all. But in 2020, that's what lit the fuse. The voter denial crowd, the Stop the Steal crowd. Now, here in Utah, a pair of lawmakers, former Representative Steve Christiansen and former Representative and current congressional candidate Phil Lyman, you can draw a straight line back to them as to reason why these voter protections have been dismantled. In 2021, Christiansen traveled to Arizona. Do you remember when Arizona did the Cyber Ninjas audit in Maricopa County? Because Trump had lost the state by 10,477 votes, and Maricopa County, which is the most populous county in Arizona, they were doing a hand recount with the Cyber Ninjas. It was a complete fiasco, and they ended up actually finding more votes for Biden when they did their hand recount. Anyway, Christiansen went down to Arizona to observe that audit and said he'd like to do some sort of forensic audit here in Utah. A few months later, Lyman joined Christiansen and they went to South Dakota when the MyPillow guy, Mike Lindell, was having his cyber symposium where they were trying to root out voter fraud. Again, voter fraud did not exist. There's no evidence, but they were looking for it. So they were there in 2021. Later that year, they also were on stage at this conspiracy-fueled conference in Salt Lake City. I attended it. My former General Michael Flynn was here for that. I tried to get an interview with him. He wouldn't talk to me. I called him a chicken on social media. I stand by that post. Anyway, so they're making all these false claims about voter fraud, but that's not all. They tried to leverage their positions as members of the legislature to get those records, to get the entire voter file. They sent letters to the lieutenant governor on their official letterhead citing some law that says as elected officials, they are entitled to this information. And they wanted it in. The other thing that stood out, and I didn't put this in my story, but I'm the one who reported on it, one of the things they asked it for is they wanted this information in very specific format, like very specific format. And if you look at the request coming from Steve Christiansen and Phil Lyman asking for this very specific format, they weren't asking for themselves. It was very clear they were asking for somebody else. They were asking for somebody else. They were trying to get this information from somebody else. Anyway, Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson rebuffed them, said you couldn't have it, and we move on. But this was all the attempt to get that information. And here's where the voter privacy comes in. There, in the election denial crowd, there are a number of people who are looking for so-called phantom voters, a conspiracy about voters voting who don't exist. And when Utah has voters whose information is private that the public can't get a hold of, and you're comparing the public voter roll to the election results, you're going to think something's weird, because in some places there are more votes than voters. And people could not wrap their head around the fact that we have voter registration records that are private, that they couldn't get their hands on. And so they're looking at this alleged discrepancy and saying that there are more, something funny's happening because there are more votes than voters. No, it's just you can't get that information because of Utah law. Well, in 2024, Phil Lyman sued the state, trying to get his hands again on the full unredacted voter roll, saying the state violated the National Voter Registration Act, NVRA. He said because the state refused to turn over the full unredacted list, they were violating NVRA. Well, the judge threw his case out, but Senator John Johnson cited that as a reason why he sponsored SB 153, and Todd Weiler, Senator Todd Weiler, had posted online, thank Phil Lyman for this. He says that SB 153 was enacted in response to a lawsuit filed by Phil Lyman due to an existing federal law that was not previously enforced. The legislature was advised that either we needed to pass legislation to make this change or the court would eventually force us to do so. So Lyman is a convenient scapegoat for this, but his election denial claims, all these fact-free claims of election fraud, that is the reason why the state's going to dox 300,000 voters and make their information public. Now, what information is going to be public? Well, it's not, it's going to be your name, address, political party you're registered with. Don't think your phone number is going to be part of that. I don't think your email is going to be part of that. Your age is not going to be part of it. It'll be like an age range. So you're not going to see your birthday, but people are going to be able to look you up and see if you are a voter, and look up and see which elections you voted in. Not how you voted, but which elections you voted in. I do have access to the public version of the voter file. I can look up if people voted. I find that very helpful as a reporter to see when people registered with a political party, and which elections they voted in. I think that is important context when you're reporting on elected officials. But now there's going to be about 300,000 people who were previously private who are now going to be public starting next month. So that's how we got here. You can draw a direct line to this move from here right back to Phil Lyman and his merry band of election deniers. So if you have any thoughts on that, love to see them in the chat. Anything else you want to talk about? Want to hear about that as well. Elliot Nutter says, I see Senator Lee supported it. Do you think that puts him in some hot water for this election or not? Or I see that Trevor Lee. Well, Trevor Lee was the House sponsor, and he actually sponsored almost exactly the same bill last year, HB 270, which got through the House, but the Senate didn't do anything with. So they tried to do this last year as well. I don't think it's going to get him in any hot water because it did pass with overwhelming support in both houses. More than 2/3 in both houses. And they kind of had to do it because of Phil Lyman's lawsuit. So this privacy, it hasn't always been there. We up until 2017, your voter information was public. Before 2014, anybody could buy it for any reason. In fact, a guy from New Hampshire did. He posted it online. And if you weren't paying attention to politics at that time, I remember it pretty well. There was absolute panic among voters, among legislators. I remember Senator Maine was really upset that a lot of this personal information about her was just posted online. Now you can find out pretty much anything about anybody if you want, but states are going. The state is going to be adding to that. Let's see. Other questions. Binel 3910 on YouTube says, equal protection. Why is a policeman and not a journalist or a professor or animal control? I don't think there's any data that police are more at risk than many professions, not an attorney. I think that people will be... I know that I'm going to ask to have my information redacted because I am a public figure and I have received threats. And I don't want that information getting out there. So I'm going to be filling out that form. But the number of private records is going to be so much smaller than the approximately 300,000 we have now. Because anybody can request to make it private at any time. In fact, if you go to the Lieutenant Governor's website and look at the website where you can buy the voter file, they say they're not going to give it to you until after May 25th, because that's when all the voter information is going to be made public. J. Lynch 5191 says, so will state senators and House representatives be able to be doxxed? If you can get a hold of the voter file, that's the whole thing. You have to have a reason to have the voter file. In 2019, Senator Jane Anderegg, who sponsored the bill in 2020 that said political parties could get a hold of this information, he made it so that state lawmakers can not give their address when they're filling out their candidacy forms. They can do a post office box. They can make their address the state capital. That is a public record. So he made it so that lawmakers could do that. And they've implemented a few other privacy things for state employees that just so happens to include Utah lawmakers. I'll have to write about that. I remember they passed one probably back in, I think, 2023, maybe. It was former Representative Kara Birkeland did one that said state employees, the state would have to pay to use a service like Delete Me, which will scrub your information from the internet for state employees who ask. And state lawmakers were one of them. But I'll have to look at that. Audrey Evans says, where does this lead us? Well, it leads us to where the voter information is public. It's not like anybody can go down and buy it. I mean, you don't need to completely freak out about it. But what's going to happen is you're going to get more political texts, more political emails. You'll get more political mailings, because that information is going to be there. And if you go through a political data warehousing service, the one that I have an account with is L2, and they're pretty good. They combine the voter roll with a whole bunch of other information, and you can add your own information, but they have a whole bunch of other information. And for a lot of people, if I so choose, anybody, and I should bring up my voter record. But they merge it with a lot of other data that's available out there. So not only will you see a person's name, address, what party they're with, whether they're the elections that they voted in, whether they're a high propensity voter, a medium propensity voter, a whole bunch of analytics. But they also merge with other publicly available information, and a lot of that I don't have access to because I don't pay for it. But I know they have it out there where there's consumer information, there's phone numbers. So there's already a lot of data out there, but it's pricey to get your hands on it. This is just going to make targeting for political campaigns a lot easier. Under Utah law, you still cannot buy the voter file for purely commercial purposes. It has to be, again, journalistic, research, political, something like that. So it's not like every Tom, Dick, and Harry is going to be able to go out and just buy the voter file. You can't do that. But your information is going to be available to more political campaigns, and it's I'm struggling to find the exact word, but I wouldn't say that it's a complete. It's not like it's going to be a giant billboard on I-15 rolling through everybody's voter information. It's not going to be public. It's not going to be widely available, is what I'm saying. It's still very hard to get a hold of this. So there. That's where we sit with that. Let's see. Looking over here. Michael O'Malley says, heading into a historically dry summer, any comments on HB 48 wildfire? Good for the hive, bad for the hive. I'm not incredibly familiar with HB 48. I'm sorry. Doesn't come off the top of my head. I'll have to look that one up, but I'll make a note here to talk about that in a future live stream. Sorry about that. Katie Did It on YouTube says, speaking of voter fraud, there's been chatter that Senator Mike Lee is on a short list for Trump's attorney general. Do you know any odds? I'm not a betting man. I don't know if he's going to do it or not. There have been reports that that he's being pitched to Donald Trump. I don't know if he wants the job. If he does take it, I think that he would be confirmed immediately, almost unanimously in the Senate. Why? There was a fantastic report in Puck.News last week that made me laugh. That basically said Mike Lee is the most despised member of the Senate. It used to be Ted Cruz. Now it's Mike Lee. Mike Lee is absolutely despised by his colleagues, and it's because of his relentless pushing of the SAVE Act, which we've talked about before. And they said, he calls out his colleagues online. He fundraises online all about this SAVE Act, calls out his colleagues, trolls them online, but behind closed doors, when he's meeting with members of his caucus, he has no plans for how to get this through. He's called for a talking filibuster, which, would force them to stay on the floor. And according again to Puck News, when Senate Majority Leader John Thune tries to get him to engage, says, what's your plan for managing the floor? What's your plan for making this happen? Lee has nothing. He does not engage. So he's not entirely serious about this SAVE Act, but he is so despised, according to Puck, that he would be immediately confirmed just to get him out of there. Same thing if Trump decided to nominate him for the Supreme Court if we have a retirement. And all signs are beginning to point that Sam Alito, who Mike Lee clerked for twice, may be heading for the exit after this term ends. He's got a new book coming out. It's coming out on the first day of the next term. That's highly unusual. That's the first sign. There was a report last week that in March, Alito was hospitalized, and that wasn't previously reported. So I don't know if Sam Alito is heading for the exits, but Mike Lee would certainly be a top candidate to replace him. The only thing going against him is his age. He's in his 50s, and I think that they would want someone younger since it's a lifetime appointment. Elliot Nutter on TikTok says, pretending Mike Lee gets in, who would be our replacement center? Funny story how that works. In Utah, the governor does appoint a replacement, but he doesn't have 100% discretion on who that replacement is. Right now, it's the legislature. The legislature would be the group that picks three names. They would pick three people. Let me find this here. But they would pick three people, three names to send up to the governor. It's not the Senate, it's the legislature. And they changed that a few years ago. I think they changed it back in maybe 2009, around the time that Orrin Hatch's health began to fail. It used to be that those three names were up to the state central committee of whatever party that the sitting senator is. And if you know anything about the Republican State Central Committee, the types of people they would pick as those three names versus the three names the legislature would pick, it's if you want to talk about extremists, if you want to talk about far-right culture warriors, John Birch societies. I mean, Mike Lee's a John Bircher, but someone who's even more extreme than Mike Lee. That's who the State Central Committee would pick. So the legislature changed that. So now it is the legislature that would pick three names. It has to be from the party of the sitting senator. So you cannot pick a Democrat to replace Mike Lee. It would have to be a Republican if Mike Lee were to step down. And they would serve until the next election, which would be I think they would have to have a special election, maybe or it'd be until the end of his term in 2028. Anyway, they would have to have a special election to fill that. And that's who would be in that seat. But it would be the legislature who picks those three names, and the governor gets to pick that name. A few years ago, when John Swallow stepped down as Attorney General, there was a standoff between the Republican State Central Committee and then Governor Herbert over picking his replacement, because the State Central Committee, the names that they were going to send him or were talking about sending him, Herbert told them, I'm not picking any of them. I know one of the names was Morgan Philpott, who had run for Congress a couple of times, but he had revealed himself to be pretty far right, had some political views that were fairly out there. That was one of the names that they were going to send, or they were just going to send one name and it was going to be Morgan Philpott. Anyway, that's that. If I remember this correctly, and Herbert told them, if you send me that name, I'm going to say no. And that was sort of a standoff between the State Central Committee and Herbert. And so they decided to pick Sean Reyes, who had run against Swallow in the Republican primary the year before. And we all know how that worked out. So, yeah, it would be up to the legislature to choose three names. And can you imagine the jockeying? Because there are at least three members of the legislature who would very much like to be in the U.S. Senate. Plus, there are a lot of other people, a lot of other elected Republicans who would very much like to be in the U.S. Senate. So the jockeying, the lobbying, the politicking to be one of those three names would be incredible. I could not even imagine what the backroom dealing would look like. So Rald66 on YouTube, back to the issue of the voter rolls. They said, can it be purchased once, then published online? No. If you purchase it and then publish it online, I'm sure the state will. There are some penalties. I don't know what, I don't have the code in front of me, but I seem to remember that those restrictions apply, that you could probably be sued civilly for violating that. Again, I haven't tried to buy the voter rolls. I use a third-party service, L2. They're the ones who buy the voter rolls, and then they use it for political purposes. And I have a lot of restrictions on what I can do with that information. So it's all very tightly controlled. Now, I know a lot of this, it feels like honor. You're working on the honor system, that you promise not to use this, but I'm sure that there are some pretty hefty civil fines involved if someone were to buy it and then post it online. Let's see. Anything else you want to talk about, please leave it in the chat. I will try to get to it as soon as possible. Let's see. What else do we have here? The Forward Party. I don't know. I'm sure you saw this, but the Forward Party had their county conventions over the last month, and they decided not to endorse a candidate in Congressional District 1. January Walker had declared she had previously run for legislature under the now defunct United Utah Party. She was in the race in 2022 and then in the special election in 2023 to replace Chris Stewart. And she was running for the Forward Party nomination, but the delegates decided to say no candidate at this time. And the sense that I was getting is that If you've seen some of her social media posts, they have gotten really, really odd. And that's putting it mildly. Some of her social media posts, some of the things she's been saying online has become really, really odd. And from what I understand is she did not inform the party at all that she was going to be seeking their nomination. They didn't know anything about it, so they decided not to advance her to the ballot. So she is not a candidate. They also did that in House District 3. Ben Shaw was running for the Forward Party nomination there. The delegates chose no candidate at this time. Speaking of the Forward Party, they're having their state convention on Saturday at Salt Lake Community College. I believe it is... I forget which campus it's at. I forget the name, but they're having their convention. And Andrew Yang, who ran for president in 2024, I believe and in 2020 as well. Andrew Yang is going to be in town. He's going to be the keynote speaker. When they had their first state convention last year, Christine Todd Whitman, who was also one of the founders of the Forward Party, was in town for that. So I'm planning on heading over to that. Hopefully I'll be able to get some chance to sit down with Andrew Yang and talk to him about that and then I also head over to the Democratic Party convention at Jordan High School. And then next week we've got the Salt Lake County Convention and the Davis County Convention, and I'm torn between which one I should go to. There's very interesting things afoot at both of those Republican conventions, and I can only be at one place, and they're pretty far apart, so I'm still deciding which one I'm going to go to. I'm thinking about going to the Davis County Convention simply because I want to say hello to President Stuart Adams. Haven't had a chance to talk to him much since they refused to give me a press pass and I sued them. So, I as I said before, I think he misses me, and I think it's probably a good time to go up and just get a little FaceTime with the president of the Utah Senate. So I'm thinking about heading up there, but I'm also thinking about possibly doing the Salt Lake County Convention. I'm not sure which one. Speaking of the Salt Lake County Convention, if you remember, a couple weeks ago, I wrote a story about how they were going to block some candidates from participating in convention, including Trina Christensen, who's running for state school board, because she had not been registered as a Republican for a year. That is a new rule that they passed last year, and they also put it into the state party constitution. Well, the Salt Lake County Republican Party looked at that rule. There was a lot of probably backlash, keeping Trina Christensen out of the race for state school board, and so they decided the rule just didn't apply to them because of one word, because of a one-word discrepancy. The state Central Committee of the Utah Republican Party, they added a bylaw that requires, quote, a person seeking to run as a Republican candidate for partisan elected office to show a full year of continuous GOP registration. And then at the state convention, delegates put that into the state party constitution, but there said a person seeking to run as a Republican candidate, a Republican state candidate. So there's a one-word discrepancy. Is it a Republican candidate or is it a Republican state candidate? Well, Salt Lake County GOP says for these county-only races, it doesn't apply. So she's on the ballot. And I know there's a couple of other candidates who were not going to be allowed to participate in the convention because of that rule. They're now back on the ballot. Joshua Taylor on YouTube says, Forward Party Convention, April 11th, Salt Lake Community College, the Taylorsville Campus Student Center, same place it was last year. I'm going to probably be running back and forth between that one and the Salt Lake County Democratic Party Convention. If you find me, I'll have stickers. Come find me, and I'll give you one of the Utah Political Watch stickers. I'm happy to hand those out to you. So, speaking of elections, all right, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of this, and this is something I'm very, very proud of, and I'm going to be debuting it in probably this week. It's something I've been working on for a long time. I've come up with the Utah. Let me pull up my notes because I have to explain the methodology to you. But it is the Utah Political Watch race ratings. I looked at every Senate race, every House race. And what I did was, I'm finding my notes here, I've come up with two ratings. One is a pure political power rating. It just looks at looks at electoral results across the district to kind of figure out what might be happening. So way to explain it here. Let me find it here. So basically, I came up with two ratings. There is a likely outcome rating, and then there's something I call the Utah Competitiveness Index, and it's based on the Cook Political Report. It's sort of my version of the Cook Political Report. So the likely outcome, I basically take a look at every district. I analyzed 8 statewide races between 2016 and 2024, presidential, gubernatorial, attorney general, combine those with actual legislative results for the Senate, 2022 for these districts, for the House, 2022 and 2024. More recent elections are weighted more heavily than older ones. I did not include the 2022 U.S. Senate race between Mike Lee and Evan McMullin because that could distort the results. Looked at all that together, came up with a formula to weight how I looked at those results, and I came up with two ratings. The likely outcome is based on the raw share of the vote a Republican or Democratic candidate has historically received in that district. For instance, if there is a district where Republicans typically get 70% of the vote, that will rate differently than one where they get 55%, even though they both traditionally elect Republicans. That's the first rating. The second rating is called the Utah Competitiveness Index. What this does is it measures how every district performs relative to the Utah Republican baseline of approximately 64.5%. So the baseline of what Republicans get statewide is about 64.5% of the vote. So I looked at which races are competitive when you look at that rating, the competitiveness index. A district can be lean R, safe Republican on the likely outcome scale, while it could carry a UCI score that's lower, which means that Republicans could still win that district easily, but the district is more Democratic than the typical legislative district. Okay, that's all of that to, it's a long way to explain it. So let me just bring it up here. I'm going to show you what I've been working on. This right here, and this is my working on it in Flourish, but this is the race ratings for the Utah State Senate. There's not a lot of competitive races. I'm only seeing 2 races that could be competitive this year, according to these numbers. Let me scoot this over here so you can see it on the vertical feed. So these are all the districts over here that are up this year. And I'm showing you this because this isn't where the good stuff is. The good stuff is in the House district, and that's only going to be available to paying subscribers. You guys can see this because that's not where the good stuff is. So for instance, Senate District 1, which is Scott Sandel's district. That one, the likely outcome is safe Republican. UCI rating is likely Republican. And it would help if I actually had my numbers up here. So let me do that so I can talk about what you are seeing here. Okay, well, there we go. All right, having to bring this up. Sorry, my computer's a little slow with all the streaming here. But in Senate District 1, typically the Republican gets 81% of the vote and the Democrat gets 19% of the vote. So that's why you'll see it right here, rated as safe R. But on the competitiveness index, which against the Republican baseline of 64.5%, that's the baseline vote, it still ranks fairly high, which is R plus 15.9. So against that Republican baseline, this district, Senate District 1, is 15.9% more Republican than the statewide baseline. That's pretty easy. Now, there's two districts here that are rated as toss-up R. Those are what according to my calculations, those will be the competitive seats this year. Senate District 5, pull that over here so I can see it. Senate District 5 is the open seat with Ann Milner. Now, obviously, we're going to have to look at candidate quality and who is the Democratic nominee between Dakota Worth and Cristina Hernandez. But right now, that is rated as a toss-up Republican on the competitiveness index. And why? Well, the Republican typically gets 62% of the vote here. The Democrat typically gets 38% of the vote. When you look at that district, compare it to the Republican baseline of 64.5, here you get an R plus 1.2 advantage, and that's why I'm rating it as a toss-up. So even though I expect the Republican to win that race, it is more Democratic than the typical Senate district, if that makes sense. The other race that I rate as competitive, SD 19, that is Kurt Cullimore's district. And here's why. In that district, it looks a heck of a lot like Senate District 5. Typical Republican gets 62% of the vote. The typical Democrat gets 38% of the vote in that district. But when you look at but that's why it is lean R, okay? But when you look at the district under the competitiveness index, which measures the district against the Republican baseline, it's only R plus 0.8. So that is a much more Democratic district than the Republican baseline. I still expect the Republican to win it. That's why I have lean R as the likely outcome. But under the competitiveness index, it's a toss-up, if that makes sense to y'all. So that is the thing that I have been working on for quite a while. These are going live later this week, not only for the Senate, which I just showed you there, but for the House as well, all 75 House races. And there are probably about a dozen House races that I would rate as potentially competitive. Now, these things are going to shift as we get fundraising numbers, as we look at candidate quality, as we look at incumbents in the race, who emerges from the conventions and the primaries. That's all going to impact all of this, and those ratings are going to shift. But this is something that I've cooked up, and it's going to be only for paying subscribers at Utah Political Watch or my website, utahpolitics.news. I'm really excited about this. It's nerdy stuff, but hopefully it works. Hopefully my theory works out in November, and we look at what happens with these districts. Because when you look at the Senate races, there are really only two seats that could be, as it stands right now, could be competitive. I'm going to factor in fundraising. For instance, if there is a Republican seat where a Democrat raises a bunch of cash, that's going to change the rating, obviously. And if there's a Democratic seat where a Republican raises a bunch of cash, that's going to change the calculations. So that's one thing that I'm working on. I'm really excited about it, and I'm going to be debuting it this week for y'all to see at utahpolitics.news. The House district the House map is where the action is, and I've come up with interactive maps. In fact, I can show you what the Senate map will look like. It's going to take me half a second to get to it here, though. Let me pull that up here. Pull that up over here. I just got to find the link here. I should have done this earlier again. There we go. So this is what the Senate map will look like. Let me pull it up, and then I'll bring up the screen share again. this up here so we can see it. Okay, well, you can't see the whole Senate thing on the vertical map. I apologize for that. But this is kind of what it looks like here. And when you hover over each one of the districts, like here on Senate District 1, if you can see that, the rating is safe R. The competitive index is R plus 15.9. Typical Republican vote share, total Democratic vote share, seat status, Republican incumbent, election result, Republican uncontested in 2022, presidential election in 2024, presidential election results in 2020, and then I've got the partisan voter registration breakdown. That is a 61% Republican district. So that'll be the other tool that will be available for subscribers when I take this thing live later this week. And again, I'm really excited about it. I'm pretty proud of it. It took a lot of work for me to get this done. And I'm excited for y'all to take a look at it and dig into it. So that will be available for you later this week at utahpolitics.news. Okay, I've been doing this for about an hour. I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about. Last call for comments, last call for questions. Leave them in the chat as we try to wrap things up. I appreciate your time and your attention this evening. Glad we're not having Armageddon, or Armageddon is pushed back for 2 weeks. Because frankly, I've got tickets to go see Bruce Springsteen next week in Phoenix. And I'm pretty excited about that. So, I'm not saying it's still cool to blow up the world after that. But I'd kind of like to see that show. Everything I've seen from this. And I put the whole playlist. I'm kind of a dork. So I put the whole playlist into, I put the whole set list into a playlist on Apple iTunes. And, you want to talk about all these MAGA people who are really upset about Bruce Springsteen and how political this tour is. Y'all have never listened to his lyrics at all. You've never listened to his lyrics. Question in the chat from Joshua. What do you think are Emily Buss's odds of keeping her spot in SD11? That's a Republican seat. SD11, as I'm pulling up my ratings, my rating is it's likely Republican. The Utah Competitiveness Index, it's still R plus 4.3. So it's more Democratic than a lot of other districts when compared to that Republican baseline. In 2022, we don't have a lot of election results to look at. It was Republican uncontested in 2022. In the 2024 presidential election, Trump won that seat 68-32. In 2020, Trump beat Biden 66.8 to 33.2. Partisan breakdown, Republican 48, nonpartisan 32, Democrat 12. So I don't, if you just look at the numbers, that's a Republican seat, and you would expect it to swing back into Republican hands. The only reason it belongs to the Forward Party is because the incumbent, Daniel Thatcher, who was a Republican and was uncontested in 2022, he didn't have an opponent in the November election, switched his party affiliation, and then he retired. That's the only reason why the Forward Party has that seat now. So that's an anomaly. That's an outlier. I don't like her chances. But again, never say never. Maybe the power of incumbency helps her a lot, but I do know that the candidates, including former Representative John Notwell, is really gunning for that seat. He has a lot of money. Chris Sloan is collecting signatures. As of right now, he does not have enough to qualify for the ballot. Notwell and Brooks Benson are the other Republicans running for that seat, and they are. If you hear the panting in the background, that is my dog Murphy. She has come in to tell me that it is time for treats. I don't know if you can see her on the camera. I can't get the camera down that low, but she's right here. She's still here, folks. We had a little bit of a setback this last week with her, but she's still here, and she has a schedule, and so she has come in to tell me that it is time to have some treats, time for me to shut down the live stream and get some attention from Dad. So that's what I'm going to be doing. Anyway, thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your questions. My email's on the screen. My socials are on the screen. Give me a follow, and we can keep in touch that way. Send me your news tips. You can send me DMs. I have a news tip form on the website, utahpolitics.news. If you want to get my journalism, if you want to get my journalism in your inbox, just subscribe there for free. If you want to support what I do, you can become a paying subscriber. And hey, if you're a paying subscriber, you'll get access to my new nifty House and Senate race ratings. That's an exclusive. Nobody else in the market is doing this. I spent the time digging into that and making all the graphics and everything. I'm really excited about it. I'm excited for you to see it when it fully goes live. That's for paying subscribers, $5 a month, and you get access to that. You can also throw some money in the tip jar. Anyway, I have a dog who's demanding my attention, so I need to dip out. Everybody, I will be at both the Forward Party Convention and the Salt Lake County Democratic Party Convention on Saturday. Come and find me, and if you do, I will give you one of my Utah Political Watch stickers. So I look forward to hearing from you. Come up and say hello. Maybe we'll take a selfie, ask me some questions, and you can have an IRL experience with this live stream. Anyway, once again, thank you so much for your time this evening. I will have this as a podcast tomorrow. If you missed any of it, you can go back and listen to it or watch it online. Again, have a great evening, everybody. See you on Saturday, and stay safe. Bye.